Well, as we begin this week, I invite you to pause this if necessary and open up the lecture outline for this week and follow along on the lecture outline and put in any comments, notes that you may find helpful in fleshing that out. Last week, we began to consider the revelation that God is real and that God has certain characteristics that have tremendous relevance for those of us who are God's creatures. This week, we want to consider then God's relationship to the world that He has brought into being. And in particular, we want to attend to the problem of evil being an aspect of this created reality in which we live, and also the wonder or the gift of common grace. And as we do, I want to underscore just how important both of these topics are to our consciousness, our perspective on life as Christians, and to explore with you their potential significance in how you interpret and frame your work as a Christian therapist. So in this class, we're going to consider all of these things, and in particular, how they impact you, and especially clients who may be shaped by religious convictions on these matters. So let's begin at the beginning with God's creation of the world, recorded in epic, memorable way in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. I've given you on the lecture outline a little thumbnail description of the Christian claim that everything that is was brought into being by an intentional act of a benevolent creator. And there are a number of very significant consequences of this claim of nature being, and here are the words of faith, creation. And so, you know, a lot of Christians get very bent out of shape debating how literally we ought to interpret the Genesis accounts. That debate is really a bit of a sidebar to what is much more important and significant. And that is that we're faced and confronted with the sheer fact of divine creation. And that's really where the greater significance lies. That what has been brought into being was created in such a way that the Creator looks on it and says, this is good. That fundamentally reality is a good thing. And it is valued by the Creator. And that this didn't happen simply by a random accident or chance, but it was purposive, a purposive act of creation, so that it's reasonable for Christians to assume that life does have meaning and history does have purpose. And so our task is not to create meaning, but to discover that purpose and meaning, and to align ourselves with it so that we are in sync with the Creator's own purposes. This is profoundly important. The other thing is that as creatures of a Creator's initiative, we all have an ownership claim upon us, not just the planet, but those of us who occupy it have an ownership claim upon it. Just as writers protect their intellectual property, inventors secure copyright protection, the Creator has a legitimate ownership claim. And so as we think about life as human beings, as Christians, we are not our own. We are beholden to one who is greater. And that is the very foundation of both our dignity and our humility as created beings. Now, I think that we can navigate the potential conflicts between what science has established a consensus on with respect to the age of the earth and the processes by which life in its current forms exists, the processes by which it developed. We can recognize there's a tremendous tension between those claims of science and a literalistic interpretation of the biblical accounts of creation. And so that tension between the two has created a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance for many who remain Christians. It's created a great deal of abdication of the faith for many others because they no longer believe that the faith is compatible with the obvious evidence of science. I think a much healthier pathway forward is to acknowledge that while the creation accounts tell us some very important things and that they are true and that they are inspired, they are nonetheless truth in a kind of poetic narrative form that allows us to reconcile their true intent with the findings of science. That kind of congruence, that kind of integration is so important to a healthy faith. And it's there for the asking if we will just drop some of our fundamentalist literalism when it comes to how we interpret the Scriptures. We are never to concede that Scripture is wrong, but we are to correctly handle the truth and interpret it properly. I'm going to just stop there because I think it's easiest to handle these lectures in bite-sized chunks. So let's stop with that, and I'll continue on with the next segment in a moment.